All right. Well, today we have an amazing guest on the Italian American Stories podcast, Marianna Gatto. She is the executive director and co-founder of the Italian American Museum in Los Angeles, and she just wrote a new book, The Italian Americans of Los Angeles, as well. So we're very honored to have you on, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, it's great. And you and I have a connection. We're Colorado Italians,
Yes,
and I
yes,
mean you're a Los Angeles native, but you have those ties
yes,
to Colorado.
yes. I was born in Los Angeles. I've lived here most of my life, but my dad was born in Colorado. My grandmother, actually, my dad's mother was born in Colorado. And my family settled there in 1898
Nice.
and then relocated to Los Angeles in 1948. But
Oh,
a
cool.
few years ago, I actually got a little place in the same neighborhood where my dad grew up. And it's transformed my life being back. I absolutely love Colorado.
Oh, me too. Yep. Yeah, my family, like late 1800s, they settled. I think our first ancestor was like 1870, who
Oh,
from Italy. Yeah, and then most of us stayed here. We did actually have some that went to California as well. So, like in the
and
late
we're in
20s,
Italy. We're in
Potenza,
Penza.
Basilicata region. Yeah. Yep. So,
Beautiful. I love
yeah,
Basilicata.
yeah. My husband and I are actually thinking about going next year, so I'm
Gorgeous.
pretty excited.
Yeah. I
Oh,
love like the connections between like Pueblo, which is where my family's from in southern Colorado and Denver. Uh,
mhm.
a lot of just historically and still today, I find it fascinating.
Oh yeah, there's still quite a bit of connections down there.
Yes.
There's the bakery there.
Well,
What's
oh,
that?
Gagliano or
Gagliano's. Yeah,
yes,
they
I
have
love it.
their.
We're actually from the same village. We're like
Oh,
distantly, probably like DNA relatives.
oh my gosh, that's so cool.
Luca
Their
Nicola.
fig cookies are so good.
Yeah, the cucciarati. Actually, I had the honor of making some with Josephine one year, and we kind of compare notes because I'm also like the cucciarati fanatic. I make like 900 of them every Christmas.
Oh, nice.
So like we had great time together in the kitchen, and yeah, I'm hoping to see them when I'm there
Oh,
this
what
week.
a cool experience. That's awesome. I found some really neat pictures. I think it's like the Library of Congress or something, and they have a ton of pictures of Pueblo Italians. I mean,
Yeah.
just a ton, like St. Joseph's tables and stuff.
Yeah.
So if you ever get a chance, you'll have to look at that. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. That was like, I think those were done like in the 80s
They
or
look
maybe,
like 80s photos.
yeah. And one of the women who was profiled is Andanuccio is her name. And we are also like cousins through marriage and through blood.
Oh, cool.
And she was famous for her St. Joseph table. So anyway, it just yeah, it was surprising when I found the collection because Pueblo is often, it's overlooked sometimes,
Sure.
and just to see it documented so well and some of those stories that were recorded, I just found it fascinating.
It is. It's very fascinating. Colorado can sometimes be overlooked Italian wise, but then Pueblo is definitely, you know,
Yes.
yeah, and Grand Junction where I'm from too.
I read this statistic once that like by 1920, 10% of Colorado was Italian.
Wow.
Yeah. And I just, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's been created in Colorado by Italians that also kind of unknown, like little but there's so much history there.
There is. There's a lot. Yeah, I find it all the time and I have like binders of research of stories from Colorado. I'm like, I think I could turn that into a story. There's another cool thing.
Absolutely. Actually, I hope like down the road, just for my own, like this isn't I'm working on a short story that took place or that takes place in Colorado in the early 1900s, and it's
Mm,
based on true events and Italian American women's stories. And one of these days, hopefully,
nice.
yeah.
We all have those lists of things we're trying to get through, right?
Because we all know that writing is so profitable.
Yes, exactly. Actually, that's a perfect segue. Why don't we go ahead and dive into your book? Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and dive into your book? So, what was your inspiration for your book? Because it's the
Well,
Italian Americans of Los Angeles, right?
yeah, the Time Records of Los Angeles. So as I mentioned, I was born here in Los Angeles, and from a very early age, being Italian or Italian American, figured really prominently in my identity. It was something that just kind of my Italian heritage like ignited this spark in me. It was just something that I found fascinating, and I think you could probably relate to this in Los Angeles, unlike places like maybe like New York or Chicago. Um, while we have Italian American communities, uh, sometimes you have to look a little bit further and deeper in order to like find that mirror,
Hmm.
be whenever I met, a fellow member of the tribe, it was like there was this immediate connection. But, again, like sometimes the tribe is a lot smaller here. So growing up in Los Angeles, I didn't always understand how I fit into my city. I grew up in a really diverse part of, I mean, Los Angeles as a whole is a pretty diverse city. But my community in particular, like in my Catholic elementary school class of 31, there were 23 different nationalities represented, or 23 different countries. And I was the only Italian American.
Hmm.
So, I just didn't always understand how I fit into Los Angeles as an Italian American, but I also didn't really understand how I fit into Italian America as an Italian from Los Angeles.
Sure.
And so the question that kind of formed in my mind was like, do Italian Americans have a history here?
Hmm.
Because it was never discussed. I was kind of the kid who spent her summers at the library. And I would, basically go back then, it was like the card catalog, finding every book about Los Angeles and every book about Italian Americans in search of Italian American history in Los Angeles.
Sure.
And it was just very like sparse, So when I was in college, I learned about a building on the edge of downtown called Italian Hall, and it had been constructed in 1908 to serve as a community gathering place. And so that really kind of like provided this like affirmation that, Italians did have this history in Los Angeles. And it just kind of fueled my research. It sparked my curiosity. And so I started kind of digging.
Yeah.
And I, found it perplexing that Italians began settling in Los Angeles in 1827, before California's statehood. So California becomes a state in 1850. Italians are here over 2 decades previously, and
Wow.
previous to that. And they figure so prominently in a lot of different aspects of California, or let's just stick to Los Angeles for now, to Los Angeles's development, I should say. But there was just very little that memorialized them. There had been one other historian who wrote about the Italians in Los Angeles, kind of in an abbreviated fashion, Gloria Ricci Lothrop, and I kind of devoured everything that she wrote, and then kind of said like, all right, well, I want to know more. And so basically, to answer your question, I mean, this book came out last year, at the end of last year, but it's probably over 20 years in the making.
Wow.
Just, like finding, little things that then lead you to other places and other sources. And my intent was to create kind of like your first comprehensive, so to speak, history of Italian Americans on Los Angeles. And I after finishing this book, I realized, there's still more. There's always more that can be discovered. But this book is really designed to hopefully give people like an overview, um, both native Los Angeles natives, California natives, and Italian Americans from all over the country, and anybody who's just kind of curious,
Yeah.
because there's so many people and events in this book that relate to, a variety of topics, both within Italian America, within local history, and beyond.
Yeah, I'm sure it has Los Angeles history in there as well because
Yes.
they were part of that.
Yes.
And it
And you
is, it's
divide the two, right?
exactly, yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because when I think of California and I think of a little Italy, I think San Francisco.
Yeah.
And so it is interesting. It's kind of, I guess you could take it back to our Colorado conversation where, you've got Denver and Pueblo. And so you've got San Francisco and Los Angeles, and there's a rich community there, but it sounds like the history is not as well taught or recorded.
Yes, for sure. And then you could probably add like San Diego to that mix too,
Sure.
but yeah, it's interesting that Los Angeles has, and again, like, these statistics are a little bit old. So some statistics will say the fifth largest, Los Angeles has the fifth largest Italian American community in the
Wow.
nation. And some statistics have us at the sixth largest, but either way, it's between fifth and sixth. So one of
Yeah.
the largest Italian American populations in the nation, but Los Angeles is seldom the place that comes to mind when we think of Italian American communities.
Yep.
And just again, like the fact that there's 200 years of history here. Los Angeles, I mean, some of it I think is Los Angeles itself. Los Angeles is one of the most photographed cities in the world. Um, but most people are unaware of its history, including many Angelenos. And that's a great shame and a crime in and of itself, which we can come back to if we have the time. But my hope was to kind of broaden people's awareness of Los Angeles and the many
Mm-hmm.
groups that have shaped it, and also kind of expand our awareness as Italian Americans as to just like how large this tent is. Um, we often frame Italian American history as having taken place and existing really on the East Coast and in places like Chicago. But most of our ancestors came here as economic refugees.
Mm-hmm.
They came in search of work, and they went where there was work.
Yeah.
So my Sicilian side came in through New Orleans. They cut sugar for a season or two, and then they were recruited to come west to Colorado, where the steel industry beckoned. And so if you look at the United States and you kind of trace back where there were needs for cheap labor, you
Yeah.
often find Italian American communities. And when I think we as Italian American leaders are more like inclusive and like we say, like, yeah, Denver, the Mile High Paisani,
Yeah.
you know? um, or Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
you'll find Italian Americans in Des Moines, in even places like Nebraska.
Yeah.
Uh, I think our identity as Italian Americans becomes like all the stronger. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's 15 million of us uh,
Yeah.
all over the nation. And I think the more we engage these communities that are often overlooked, the stronger we become as a community.
I completely agree. With my podcast, I try to find stories all over the country. You were talking about how if there's a cheap labor need, people will go. Italians went in Alaska. I've done a story about it, some people in Alaska, a couple of Italians. And, it's interesting because there's always a common thread in
Mhm.
those stories that identify, like whether it's Catholicism, food,
Mhm.
family, whatever, there's some sort of a thread. But I don't know if you notice this or not. There's a difference too, though, as I think, West people who live
Yeah,
West, Midwest, up in Alaska versus people who live in the East or the South. There's a difference, I think, in the way I guess our identity, the way we
yes,
portray our identity, it's different.
yes,
Where like being West in Colorado in Grand Junction, where it's a different vibe than it would be back
for
east. I think.
sure. For sure. I think some of that is like numbers,
Sure.
like what percentage of the population we were, certainly in places like New York, where you had this large community that, and immigration continued from, the 1800s into the 1900s and still today. And I mean, you find that in places like Los Angeles too. the earliest Italians began coming in the 1820s. These were often Northern Italians, different, like we think of like the differences in identity even within Italy,
Sure.
among the different regions. And I think so like the percentage of the population, what percentage Italians were, in relation to the larger group wherever they settled, the time that they settled, and like, who was living around them.
Hmm.
Um, in Los Angeles, when the first Italians arrived, it was a Mexican city. And it was, a city that was part of Mexico, ruled by Mexico. Spanish was the language spoken, the lingua franca. Catholicism was essentially the religion of Los Angeles. Los Angeles was, it's El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles, the town of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. And so Italians at that time, when they first began settling in Los Angeles, were accepted, because of the similarities between them and the, California, or the Mexican American population, or the Mexican population, because
Sure.
unless you're thinking about it in terms of like North America. But so that early group was able to achieve upward mobility at an earlier rate than many different parts of the country. But in other places, you could also make the observation, like, were Italians living in a community that was mostly Anglo, were the Anglos mostly their neighbors, or was it Italians and Poles, or Italians and Irish? And so I think that's also impacts the community's development. But like, in short, I think, like, going back to what you said, we express our identity differently depending on where we are. Like, there's so many different shades of Italian America.
Hmm.
And in places like Colorado, where a lot of the Italians were drawn to like farming, working in mines and mills,
Hmm.
different railroad, uh the place, the climate where they settled would also shape
Sure.
who they became. I think about my Sicilian family coming from this land that was, it's a pretty temperate climate,
Yeah.
where we are in Sicily, and going to like the Colorado winters, or the southern Colorado winters, which are different than Denver, not quite as severe, but
Yeah.
still, I mean, just the amount of adaptation that required.
Oh, for
You know?
sure. And even
Yeah.
thinking of some of those mining towns like Leadville
Yes.
at 10,000 feet. I mean, oh my gosh, I
Yes.
can't even imagine.
Yes. Cripple Creek, and like what's the other, and in southern Colorado, I'm blanking on the name of it, but just you know, um, they went to these places where there really
Oh,
was not much.
Trinidad.
Trinidad, yeah.
Trinidad, yeah.
Trinidad, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, where there really wasn't much. And just, how they transported their ways and their traditions to their new home, and how they still maintain those traditions.
Ah,
Um,
absolutely.
I mean, it's, we often, I think, judge ourselves. There's like this litmus test that of like Italian Americans in different parts of the country compare
Mhm.
themselves to what are often like the dominant ideas of Italian Americanness.
Yeah.
And I and I often will notice that like Italians in Italy will look at us and like kind of scratch their head and like say like, there's nothing Italian about you left. You over here 150 years ago, you don't speak the language, like what is this food you eat? But if you ask an Italian in Denver or Trinidad or Pueblo, what they are, they'll answer you, they'll connect it to their little villages. And
Yeah.
the idea that 150 years later that those feelings are so strong,
Hmm.
I think speaks volumes.
Oh, for sure. It absolutely does. Yeah, because it doesn't die in us. It kind of keeps
Oh,
going.
it continues. Yeah.
Yeah. So what
And
was, oh, go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, no,
No,
you go
no.
ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, like, now, there's this big debate in Italy about citizenship
Mm,
and restrictions placed on dual citizenship. And we won't go into that, but just, the idea that so many of us still feel this closeness
hmm.
and this connection to the place where our families off left, sometimes over a century ago.
Yeah.
And I don't, I know that there's other cultures that feel that too, but
Hmm.
I think among Italian Americans, it's pretty noteworthy.
I agree. Yeah. I seem to find that as well. Even speaking with friends that are not Italian Americans, they'll like one time I was out with some friends and two people realized they were both oh, I don't know what it was, like German or Swiss, I don't know, something like that. And they were like, "Oh, I'm that too." And like that was it. And I was like, are you gonna talk about like where you were from, your recipes, like that's it? Like there's nothing else.
Yeah,
Okay, like where I feel like an Italian American would be like, oh my gosh, what village are you
absolutely. What
from?
village? You
Yeah,
did this. What do
yeah,
you call that?
exactly. Have you ever had this recipe? But that was they were like, oh, I'm that too, and that was it.
Yes,
So it
yes.
was
Or
kind of
like I
funny.
found, like I was talking to some friends who were, whose families came from Ireland. I was like, well, where are you from? I have no idea. I was like, did you ever like have that desire to, return? And I mean, I understand that some of it is a little bit more challenging, especially for like that older group of immigrants. I do a little genealogical research, here and there for people. And a couple years ago, I had donated to like a charity fundraiser, like genealogical research, like a certain number of hours. And the gentleman who won the item was from Ireland, or his family's from Ireland. And, they came in like the 1700s.
Oh
And,
wow.
back then it was like, they didn't record a lot of information. If your name is like John McFarland, 19 in 1790, there was just very little information collected at that time. It wasn't until later that we started to like, restrict immigration in this country and monitor it and record people's information. So, you know, this John McFarland is probably going to have a harder time tracing, his ancestry back to the little hamlet in Scotland, Ireland, but in, those we tend to have it a little bit easier.
We do.
Yeah.
And our names are a little bit more unique than like a
Yes.
John McFarlane and stuff like
Yes.
that. Like when I'm researching stories for my podcast, I'm always a little grateful for that because
Yeah.
going through newspaper databases and stuff, having those a little bit more unique names compared to more of the Anglo names helps.
For
So
sure.
yeah.
I love that. That's one of my favorite activities when I don't have, when I can turn off the world. It's just dive into newspaper archives.
Oh, me too. It's how I started my podcast. So looking for like my own personal families,
Yeah.
articles and stuff, and I'd run across an Italian American article about an Italian American, and I was like, oh, that's cool. So I would save it, and then one day I had a file full of articles of people I'm not related to, and I was like, I should tell their stories. So I'm right there with you. I love that. So getting back to Los Angeles, what was one of the main industries that drove Italian Americans there?
Well, so it depends on the time period. Like when the earliest Italians came to Los Angeles, in the mid 1800s, Los Angeles was primarily an agrarian city. It was, farming, ranching. The wine industry, believe it or not, actually, was much stronger in Los Angeles
Hmm.
at that time than in Northern California.
Oh wow.
Los Angeles in like the mid 1800s was actually the winemaking capital of the state. So the earliest Italians often came to farm, ranch, and make wine.
Okay.
And it didn't come with that, specific, like, I'm going to become a vintner. They often went into that industry, um, because, Los Angeles is really an ideal place for growing wine grapes, and
Sure.
lots of sunshine, a very long growing season. So the earliest Italians tended to go into those industries as well as fishing.
Mm.
Then, as Los Angeles becomes a little bit more industrial, certainly when like the Transcontinental Railroad connected Los Angeles with the rest of the nation, you see the Italian population of the city grow, and the population of the city grow, period, because, you think about Los Angeles was this remote outpost that was pretty challenging place to reach before the railroad, before the construction of the Panama Canal, uh,
Yeah.
because you would either have to sail around, and enter through, Mexico, or the land route going north, or you would have to take the land route, covered wagon going west.
Oregon Trail type thing.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and those early Italians, they were pretty hardy.
Yeah.
Um, they were a very, they came here with a purpose. And so, that early group, again, agriculture, viticulture, fishing, farming. Um, then, others came here to work on the railroad, or they would help build the canals that provided the water supply for Los Angeles. And if you're familiar with the history of Los Angeles, we're in part a city that is dependent on a water source.
Mhm.
So we don't have a lot of our own. If you ever saw the film Chinatown, um, so many would come to do manual labor, work in foundries, railroad. When there was a lot more manufacturing in Los Angeles, many would also were employed in those types of industries. Um, and then, as the economy continued to develop, you saw Italians drawn here for, a number of different reasons. Certainly as like the entertainment or the motion picture industry relocates from the East Coast to the West. You would also see Italians, craftspeople, artists, the more quote unquote creative types come
Sure.
here to work in the early motion picture industry. So there were, a lot of opportunities depending on the time period. And then, we also in Los Angeles have had this continued immigration over the years. Italians still come to Los Angeles. Many of them represent the again, creative industries, but also science, technology, fashion,
Mm.
um, food, cuisine. There's no shortage of fantastic Italian chefs who are still immigrating to the city. Um, but you had mentioned earlier the San Francisco, and I think it's also interesting to note that many Italians were drawn to California by the gold rush,
Mm.
and we saw a number of Italians who first settled in like San Francisco or in like the gold country, and then as maybe they made their little tiny fortune, and gold mining was also just a really difficult,
Oh
like
yeah.
it's like you could you could go bankrupt, or you could hit it big. Most people realize that it was better to pursue something a little bit more with a little bit greater certainty. So uh, if the name like Domenico Ghirardelli rings a bell, he was from a town near Genoa called Rapallo. And Domenico Ghirardelli originally came to the Americas through Peru. So he was in Peru for a while,
Hmm.
and then came to San Francisco, where he met up with a partner of his, a gentleman from his hometown called by the name of Ambrogio Vignolo. And again, these men tried to find fortune in mining, but they realized that it was a lot easier and more profitable to quote mine miners. So they created a general store in, Northern California. And after they made a little bit of money, Ghirardelli, of course, went on to create his chocolate empire.
Yeah.
And Vignolo traveled south to Los Angeles, where he also founded one of the city's very early general stores. He became a prominent landowner and one of the co-founders of the earliest Italian mutual benefit association or group in Los Angeles, founded in 1877.
Wow.
Designed to, this is in the day when there were no safety nets. So if you got injured on the job and you had a family, you weren't able to have, bring home an income until you were able to get back to work. And so groups like the Italian Mutual Benefit Society provided for their members in times of need, and then also really served the community as a whole. And Vignolo was one of the founders of it.
Oh,
Just
cool.
yeah, like just one last little tidbit. His niece, Isabel Vignolo, would also become a very prominent leader in the Italian American community, and she was one of the earliest women to graduate from the school that became UCLA.
Oh,
And
neat.
yeah, so like I bring her up because I try to insert Italian American women wherever possible. She was also a
Yeah.
very like prominent philanthropist, one of the founders of the Italian Women's Club. So just, a huge force in Los Angeles.
Oh, cool. Well, I was going to ask you if there was any, while doing your research, any surprising or fascinating stories that you ran across. I know they're all fascinating, but it sounds like that Isabella was pretty cool too.
Yeah, there was like with Italian American history in Los Angeles, there was so much kind of waiting to be discovered.
Sure.
And I think there's, while, this is, let's see, like 270 pages, um, there's more that I just couldn't fit, or that, you know, um, hopefully maybe in the future I'll be able to continue writing about, exploring.
Part
But
two.
yeah, part two, or the updated edition, we'll see. But yeah, there were so many amazing stories. I would say like one, if I were to name like two or three super exciting moments in my research, one would be, so I'll just kind of like go back and set this up. So in 1904, the Los Angeles Archdiocese orders the creation of two churches to serve the Italian American community, because we were, a pretty sizable community in Los Angeles at that time. And the American Catholic Church is very concerned with what they call like the Italian problem, meaning that you know many Italian immigrants would turn to the church like for the seminal moments, for the milestones like baptism,
Mm,
maybe communion, um, marriage, and death.
sure.
And we weren't necessarily attending mass, and they weren't being good practicing Catholics. And so the Los Angeles Archdiocese Bishop Conady orders the creation of these two churches to serve the Italian community. One was St. Peter's Italian Church, which still exists today,
Mm,
and over 100 years old, located in what was one of LA's Italian enclaves.
okay.
Now it's Chinatown, like many other Italian enclaves in the nation, or historic enclaves, I should say. And that church, St. Peter's, is fascinating. If any of your visitors are in Los Angeles, it's a very welcoming church. Or did I say visitors? I meant if any of your listeners are in Los Angeles. It's an incredible community, very welcoming. They still do a lot of the Italian feast days, celebrations, and mass in Italian every week. Um, and I highly encourage folks to visit. The second church was kind of like this riddle. The second church that was, created in 1904 was Immaculate Conception.
Mm,
And that was located in a neighborhood southeast of downtown, that was then referred to as the East Side. And I find the East Side fascinating for so many reasons. One is it's, again, this lost Italian enclave in Los Angeles. Los Angeles used to have 7 Italian
Oh my
neighborhoods,
gosh.
and where Italians were the majority or, figured prominently. And the East Side, again, like maybe this is, I'm just going into my historic nerd rants, but I find it because most of the residents had relocated from different parts of Louisiana, many of them around New Orleans, and they were predominantly Sicilian.
Mm.
And they spoke a kind of a language that is an Italo-Albanian language. Some will call it a dialect, but it's really a language called Abarish. And they were Albanians who settled in Sicily in the 1400s
Oh
and
wow.
culturally, linguistically distinct. Um, so this group, leaves Sicily, goes to Louisiana, stays there for a while, and then comes en masse to Los Angeles and settle in this little neighborhood south of downtown called the East Side, which is near the wholesale produce market, which still exists. And many of them were, worked in the wholesale produce market. And it's a pretty poor community, pretty poor neighborhood. And this church, Immaculate Conception, rises up in this neighborhood. And, I find little articles about, there's masses in Italian, there's all kinds of classes and services that the church extends to the community, and as part of like Americanization efforts, but also to really tend to the community's needs. I mean, this is a community where people are dying at twice the rate because of, communicable diseases.
Mm.
And so I found the sacramental records of Immaculate Conception. Yet, interestingly enough, the Archdiocese did not have any records of its existence. And
Whoa.
yeah, so the church kind of springs up in 1904, and by like early 20s, it ceases to exist for the most part. And I was fascinated with the why,
Yeah.
what happened. And this is also the church where Mother Cabrini is active in Los
Mm.
Angeles. So there's so much like fascinating history there. And one of my personal like moments where I just was super excited, it was a few years ago. I finally found a photo of this church
Oh,
in,
cool.
yeah, in a historic newspaper that I guess had just been digitized because my previous searches unearthed nothing. And so I finally had this photo to kind of put to pair with all the images in my head.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was a great moment.
There's nothing like finding a photo. Oh,
No,
when I
yeah,
find a photo of something I'm researching, I'm like, yes, this is perfect.
yeah. And then I would say like if um one of the other like people who I found super fascinating and who I absolutely adore, and I hope one day that there's a film or something created about her life, was another Italian American woman who was a pioneer in auto racing. And
Hmm.
yeah, so she was definitely a very non-traditional woman. Her name was Nina Vitaliano, and
Mm.
she was born in LA's Little Italy, the North Broadway district, which is now Chinatown, in 1888.
Oh, wow.
And it's when she was 19, she married this very prominent Italian American by the name of Stefano Torre. And he was a steamship agent who basically was like the guy that brought thousands of Italians to Los Angeles,
Oh,
including Frank Capra's family.
oh, cool.
Capra, the director of It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, all these great films, was born in Sicily and comes to Los Angeles as a little boy. And Stefano Torre is the steamship agent that sponsors this family.
Oh,
So anyway,
nice.
Nina, Nina marries this really prominent man. And about 10 years into their marriage, they don't have children. They're still, childless. Nina is, you know, lives very comfortably. And somehow she connects with a group of women, also wealthy women in Los Angeles. Women who have when it comes down to it, like prominent husbands. And they form this group called the Speederettes. And they're an
Speederettes.
Speederettes,
Oh,
yeah,
I love that name.
all women's racing group. And at that time, women had, you know, when the automobile makes its debut and automobile racing, kicks off, women start competing in the sport. And it's not until 1909 that there are restrictions passed, or restrictions placed, I should say, on women in racing. And, they were, before that, they're racing men.
Oh
And
no.
so now they're basically like relegated to like gender segregated races.
Mhm.
Um, and this group, the Speederettes, forms, and they compete against another group of women and here in Los Angeles. And, in the early races, there are like, tens of thousands of people who are gathering to come see these women compete.
Oh, cool.
And anyway, the Nina Vitaliano, she kind of creates this persona for herself. She claims that she was born in Italy and that she's a daughter of a count, that she learned to race in Genoa, and all these like, these kind of wild stories to call attention to herself and what these women are trying to do. And so there's in the audience that day at this race in Los Angeles, there's a promoter who believes that he has this really great moneymaker on his hands. Like the crowd's going wild. There's thousands of people who come see these women race. So he offers the women the opportunity to come to Northern California, to Stockton, to compete in this race. And Nina had won her early races in Los Angeles. She's really floored, and unfortunately at the race in Stockton, she lost control of her vehicle and collided with a tree, and she was killed instantly.
Oh my gosh.
And it's this woman, Nina Vitaliano, who you've never heard of,
Mm-mm.
um, whose death led to more permanent bans against women in racing. And she is one of the reasons why racing remains this male-dominated sport.
Sport.
So you never knew that you had an Italian American that, but just so much about her life I found fascinating. I mean, she really was this free spirit.
Mm-hmm.
This is before Amelia Earhart is a household name.
Wow.
Nina Vitaliano is talking about piloting airplanes.
Oh
She,
my
yeah,
gosh.
like, probably like, probably like 7 years before Amelia Earhart, she talks about her dream to pilot airplanes. And so this is like the World War I era, when women don't have the right to vote yet.
Yeah.
Um, she's racing under her maiden name.
Mm-hmm.
I just find her this fascinating figure for, so many reasons. And I wish it was all lollipops and roses. Unfortunately, her story ends in tragedy. But I actually went to visit her grave many years ago, and she's buried under, the name Torre. So she's Nina Torre, and
Yeah.
she will always be Nina Vitaliano. Had she lived, which is, would have been fascinating to see what she could have done.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, because she was a pioneer in her own way. I mean,
Yeah.
like we have the pioneers who are Italian ancestors who came and homesteaded and all of that, but she was kind of a force of her own, especially when it comes to women. And then to like join in with a group of women and call yourself the Speedettes, is that it?
Peterettes.
Speederettes. I mean, that's amazing. That's really cool. Yeah, somebody needs to do a story, book, movie, something on her.
Yeah, I mean, she, I allocated, space in print in my book to her.
Nice.
But yeah, I would love to see her story memorialized somehow. And if I was a filmmaker, I would take a shot at it.
Absolutely. I love the unknown stories like that. Like the people that we
Yeah.
don't, that we just don't know about. Those are the kind that I like to put on my podcast for sure.
Yeah, well, you'll definitely find, several more in the book. I mean, there were like just a few people who became like my ultimate favorites, or just a lot of the information that, became my book was a result of like, more traditional research, if you will, combing through the archives and the newspapers and what other historians had found. But a lot of it also came through sitting down and talking to people.
Mm.
And I've been at this for about 20 years now. 20 years, this is my 20th. And there were so many people who contributed to this book, many of whom are no longer with us, but just like the stories they told that
Yeah.
I don't think are memorialized anywhere else. There's one couple that comes to mind, um, Margaret and Margaret Bizzetti, and her husband Louis, and who gave me just fantastic stories of wartime LA, living in Little Italy, what LA's Little Italies were like. And there's just the stories they shared are priceless. You know,
Yeah.
um, there's another couple, Sergio and Elsie Bizzetti, who lived in kind of what is now East LA, then was a very large Italian neighborhood. And, they were talking about the things that they would do on weekends. Like there was a game that dates back to Roman times called Il Tiro,
Hmm.
uh, which means the throwing or the tossing. And basically they would take this enormous wheel of cheese, like a 60, 100-pound wheel of cheese, wrap it in straps, and the men would compete to see who could throw it the
Oh,
furthest
wow.
without breaking this wheel of cheese. And it's called Il Tiro del Formaggio. And Sergio and Elsie had grown up together. When I interviewed them in like the early 2000s, they were already, approaching 90.
Yeah.
And Elsie was like just like a 12-year-old girl when Sergio went away to fight in World War II.
Oh my gosh.
He comes back, all of a sudden Elsie is, has blossomed into this young woman. And he asks for her hand in marriage. And Elsie's father says, well, I think he'll be an okay husband, though I don't really think he has very good skills when it comes to throwing the cheese.
That's
And, you know,
adorable.
they remained married for like close to 70
Oh
years.
my
I
gosh.
mean, it was just like, I feel that meeting these people, doing the research, speaking to them, a lot of them became like they became like surrogate grandparents to me. And
Yeah.
my life is so much richer for sitting down and, you know, talking face to face,
Yeah.
learning these stories that I hope that they were passed on to their grandchildren and children. But I guess in a way to be like a caretaker for some of these stories is like very special to me.
Yeah. Oh, truly, it's an honor because it gives you an insight into that Little Italy neighborhood that you
Yes,
probably can't read about. You have
absolutely.
to hear that from somebody,
You have to
and
hear.
it gives you that perspective.
Yeah, and like, when we sit around and complain about, life and what are the challenges. And listen, a lot of us do have real challenges. I don't mean to, um, deny that in any way, but you think about their lives. And I, and during some of my bad days, I kind of give myself a little bit of a reality check. Like,
Yeah.
the people who came before you had it so much worse.
Yep.
So, just even like some of the stories in my own family, my dad's family came here in 1948, and it was still, the housing market was still regulated by some of the wartime, restrictions.
Mm.
And they had to leave Colorado, but their house in Los Angeles wasn't ready yet. So my grandparents slept in like the garage of a family friend, and my dad and his brothers slept on the front porch.
Oh my
And that's
gosh.
how they lived for months until their home here was ready. And it's like, all right, like reality check. Life is good. Let's all be grateful. Replace, those woe is me feelings with a good dose of gratitude. And,
Absolutely.
um, yeah.
Because
So,
we live so different now. I can't imagine a whole lot of people being willing to sleep on a porch nowadays.
no,
We
I mean, you
just
would probably call that child abuse. And my dad and his brothers would have been collected by Department of Child Social Services,
yeah.
but somehow like they made it, they all became very productive members of society.
Mhm.
And, I'll give my dad credit where it's due. I mean, he really imparted to me, an appreciation for my heritage, a respect for my origins, and the struggles that made my life possible.
Yeah.
It's a lot of what I do today is because, I'm guided by some of these invisible hands.
That's beautiful. I love that. And so would you say that that's some of your, well, I'm sure it is some of the inspiration about with the museum as well.
Absolutely. I mean, just the idea that, Italians have contributed so much to our nation. Um, but think especially in recent years, our history is often kind of like just lumped together with something that that is very distinct from.
Mhm.
And there how can I say this? Um, I feel that our history is probably more endangered now than ever.
Mhm.
And um and to be part of its preservation, and also to be able to kind of contribute to like the discourse surrounding like the American nation. For
Mhm.
the past 20 years or so, we've emphasized STEM more than the humanities, more than like the teaching of history and culture. And to our great detriment, I feel, as
Yeah.
a nation. STEM is important, don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but especially in times like this where there's just so much noise and, I mean, forgive me, but hatred.
Sure.
um, like if we take a step back and realize like a lot of us have gone through
Yeah.
this country, and you know uh you know Italians are a very important part of this vibrant American mosaic.
Yeah.
And to be able to preserve that story, showcase those stories. And one of the things that I find super encouraging and rewarding is when visitors come to the museum. Most of our visitors, more than 80% of our visitors, are not of Italian extraction. And when they come to the museum and they say, I didn't know that Italian Americans experience this, like,
Mm.
you know, uh, this is similar to my family's experience. And we kind of develop a sense of, I think, solidarity and, shared experience, um, mutual understanding. Uh,
Yeah.
that's what I hope for. That's the America that I feel like we need to return to.
Mhm.
And without, patting us on the back, that's why I feel museums and educational institutions, programs that, uh, you know, advance our understanding are so important
Hmm.
now more than ever.
I completely agree. You look back at history and you've had, I mean, discrimination has happened to multiple groups of people. But I think you're right. I think a lot of that is being covered up, forgotten, whatever, however you want to
Yes.
put it. And so bringing it to light, and like you said, people who go to your museum who are not Italian American are like, hey, I can recognize that or identify with that because it's happened in my family's history as well.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched upon this earlier, like you know, our identity as Italian Americans is shaped by where we lived,
Hmm.
obviously like on the East Coast where there's like this much larger population, you had in some ways, like you had safety in numbers.
Hmm.
And whereas in other places where Italian Americans were more of like the minority, there were often greater pressures to assimilate, to seem a little bit less Italian. I mean, I don't I know that like for my father growing up in Colorado, to be Italian, and my dad would be 90 if he was still alive. Um, to be Italian was often associated with like a criminal class,
Hmm.
with poverty, with an immigrant group that people didn't want.
Yeah,
Literally when my dad entered school, um, he did not speak English, or at least
mm,
not to the liking of his teacher.
sure.
And she sent him home with a note pinned to his jacket on the first day of school that said, send him back when he can speak English.
Wow.
And, there weren't programs to, support kids through language acquisition. It was like, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And, I think about like, there's a chapter in my book about the World War II restrictions on Italian Americans, um, the Enemy Aliens
Hmm.
Act, and it was really on the West Coast where Italians were most affected by that. Why? A
Hmm.
few reasons. We are the West Coast is this very sensitive military zone.
Hmm.
Basically, the entire coastline is a restricted area where enemy aliens were not allowed to reside or enter. But at one time, and I guess I should provide a little bit of background here. So, like following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 600,000 Italians living in the United States who had not become American citizens were declared enemy aliens,
Hmm.
and they were subjected to like a host of restrictions. You couldn't travel for more than 5 miles outside of the radius of your home without permission. Um, you had to surrender certain things, including shortwave radios, hunting rifles. You had to register as an enemy alien and carry an identification card. Some of the members of the community who were considered like the greatest risks were arrested and sent to internment camps.
Yeah.
Many times there were no charges pressed against these people. Um, there was talk at one time about interning and relocating all Italian Americans across the nation, which would
Wow.
have been millions and millions of people.
Hmm.
And Roosevelt, to his credit, turned to his advisors and said, no, this would be detrimental to the war effort. Italians were the largest group in the American military, the largest ethnic group in the American military at that time. They were a huge Democratic voting bloc. They were basically like the lifeblood of the economy in many cities, especially
Yeah.
on the coast. So most of the impact is felt out here on the West Coast, with Italians facing, some of the most stringent restrictions. Um, so fast forward, like, what is the takeaway from this? The wartime era, when there's posters that say, like, don't speak the enemy's language, don't speak Italian,
Hmm.
speak American. Um, that generation of Italians, and I think I'm most cognizant of this because I was raised by them in this
Hmm.
area. They learned how not to be Italian.
Yeah.
They learned to kind of become more closeted Italians or Italians who engaged and expressed their ethnicity in safe places, which were often
Yeah.
at home or like if they still associated with like, you know, the Italian clubs, because many of them closed, many Italian
Yeah.
newspapers folded during that time, at least out here. So I'm speaking about, you know, Los Angeles.
Sure.
Um, it was, you know, this generation that kind of, um, you know, my dad was always very proud. He imparted a sense of pride to me. And I, you know, it was him and my grandfather that, you know, by age 5 or 6, I learned like that's what I am. And it
Mhm.
really paved the path for what I'm doing now. But they were that generation that was a little bit more hesitant.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if we try to explain why many of us are the way we are, why we're a little bit more like, you know, why we engage with our Italianità differently than many of my friends back east.
Hmm.
I think a lot of it can be traced back to the war years and being a much smaller group numerically. Um, you know, when you look at like the larger population and all the
Yeah.
folks that we were, you know, living around.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about it's a smaller population, but even in Colorado, like when you get further west in our country, it's bigger. You know, it's not so okay, for example, I was born and raised in Grand Junction, Colorado.
Mhm.
My mom was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. So she had a very large Italian community there when she grew up. And I knew I was Italian, but I never associated Italian with Grand Junction. Like
Mhm.
that's in Denver. But as I started doing my podcast, there's a really large Italian community in Grand Junction, Colorado, which is a small town comparatively. But when you said like the numbers, so like if you don't have a really large community, it's harder. So for Grand Junction, the KKK,
Yes,
more going after them for Catholicism, chased
yes,
them out, and a ton of them went to Denver. And
yes,
so, where it's like in Grand Junction to Denver, that's a 4 hour drive over mountain passes. It's not like going to the next neighborhood over. And so the Italians, I think, that were left in Grand Junction, it's very different because if they stayed, it was like don't portray this, don't do this because we're going to stay, but we still have this enemy in a way.
yes, yes. You know, I think there's that. Have you seen that very famous image? Well, I don't know how famous it is, but it's to me, just like a mind-blowing image of the clans people in their full regalia at the fair riding the Ferris wheel.
No.
Send you that image. It is like when you see it, you're like, is this real? Is this for real? And it was. I mean, that was
Yeah.
20s Colorado.
Yep.
You know, where like the Klan, even in, you know, in places like Pueblo, they despised Italians because they were Catholic, because they
Hmm.
drank alcohol, and they were immigrants.
Yeah.
And um, even when my dad was born in 34, you know, he would tell me stories that like Italians weren't allowed to go to the movie theater. They weren't allowed
Hmm.
to swim in the public pool.
Yep.
They weren't allowed to go to the dance halls. And you know, you talk about, you know, ethnicity and race are very fluid.
Hmm.
And it's situational. It's impacted by like time and place. And, you know, people will say like, oh, well, I never knew anybody that happened to. Well, yeah, well, maybe you didn't because you lived somewhere else at a different time. But this was what was taking place then.
Yeah.
And I think these stories like, are just, it is essential that we preserve them.
Absolutely. I did an episode on Fort Missoula in Montana.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was an internment camp.
Yes.
And it's fascinating. I mean, it's in a strange way, it's fascinating, but I agree we have to preserve those stories because
Yeah. In
it's
fact, that was
shaped the
where
way.
a lot of the Italians in Los Angeles were sent to Fort Missoula.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's this like one very famous story that, you know, one gentleman, he was a journalist here in Los Angeles, and he was never, he was not a fascist. He was an Italian war veteran, fought in World War I. That was back when Italy and America were on the same side. But he was considered dangerous because he was capable of influencing people.
Mm.
They arrested him in the middle of the night in December and wouldn't allow him to retrieve his coat or shoes before they put him on a train to
Mm.
Montana in the dead of winter.
Oh, jeez.
And it's interesting. Like I later, met some of his um, descendants because he died before I became aware of who he was.
Hmm.
And he might have even died before I was born. I would have to double check on that. But um, he was, he was interned for close to 2 years. And when he was released, he never spoke about it. And when he did, it was always in this very like joking kind of sort of way, like, there was this desire after the war, and I think among this generation of immigrants to just kind of sweep it all under the rug.
Hmm.
And, they never played what some people might call like the victim card.
Sure.
But in the process, a lot of these stories died with the
Hmm.
people who lived them. And, I'll give you another like example. I mean, even now, like 15 years ago, I remember like as I was writing the exhibitions that became our permanent exhibition at the museum, there was a gentleman who said I was working on what became what is our most popular exhibition, which is called Dago. And as we
Mm.
know, Dago is a not so nice term, you know, uh, for referring to Italian Americans and or Italians. And uh, this exhibition looks at the internment of Italian Americans, the history of anti-Italianism, how events like the lynching in New Orleans and other acts of violence, racially motivated violence, impacted the Italian American community. And he said to me, we shouldn't talk about that. Don't talk
Mm.
about that. You don't want to go there. And we did. So it's interestingly enough, again, it's like the most popular exhibition. It's what people spend the longest amount of time with. And there was still this hesitation,
Hmm.
this to tell these stories. Like close to a century later, we kind of we sentenced ourselves to silence.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
again, unfortunately, many Italian Americans, like what they know about their culture is limited to like the media representations of Italian Americans and food and maybe religion.
Yeah.
Like anything beyond that is yeah, I still see this hesitation to discuss these subjects and interact
Hmm.
our heritage. And it's like that is some powerful stigma
It
that
is.
that persists a century later, close to us, sometimes over a century later. And
Yeah.
like just like that internalizing is
Hmm.
like, wow. I mean, somebody like a psychologist has to do a study.
I agree that I was talking earlier about those common threads, and that's a common thread that I see a
Mhm.
lot is that like even within individual families, keeping those secrets. Like, well, we're not going to talk about that story. Don't
Mhm.
talk about that when we go over for family dinner. Don't bring this up. And it's an internalizing, like it's in the past that we don't need to talk about it. And it's like, well, but maybe we do.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's
I mean, it's the neighborhood where I am in Pueblo, not to reinforce any of these stereotypes, but like, prohibition was a huge failure. We all know that. And like, it's really hard to legislate that sort of thing. Sometimes the minute you put you criminalize something, you make it all the more attractive to a lot
Yep.
of people, right? Like on all sides. But the neighborhood where my dad grew up and where I still have a little place in Pueblo is called Goat Hill
Hmm.
because the Sicilians raised goats on they herded goats on these hills, and so it got that nickname.
Oh, that's
But
cool.
it's this high area of the city, and there's lots of legends about it. But the Italian families continued making wine. They're like, interfere with my relationship with this wonderful grape juice.
Yep, that we've had forever.
And like it's part of our faith. It's part of, wine is food. It's not, it's not whiskey.
Exactly.
And, so they're making wine, and there was apparently like, some of like legends about like tunnels under the neighborhood. There are definitely some stills in these homes, but it was up in those hills was kind of like a bootlegger's paradise, because you're at one of the higher points in the city, and you can see the fuzz, the police coming, right?
Hide the booze in the walls or whatever
Yes,
they did.
exactly.
Yep, that's true. It doesn't mean that they were criminals, but it's just
No.
fascinating.
No, and there was like, there was it kind of, I don't know if we have time for this, but it's a kind of a funny story that I came across here going back to Los Angeles. There was a woman who came here in the late 1800s, settled in Dogtown, which is another Italian enclave near downtown. And a lot of people don't realize that like during Prohibition, you could get a permit for the production of like wine, cider, for home use. Like it had to be below a certain amount of alcohol, and you could only produce a certain number of gallons a year, and you had to pay for this permit. So she did, she was producing wine in her garage, and one of her neighbors told on her. And so this woman, she's 67 years old. This is like, 1923, I believe. And like, with all respect, 67 back then was different than 67 now, right?
Sure.
So she's this like unassuming little Italian grandmother, and, they cart her off to jail, and she's put in the cell with like this group of like kind of boisterous young women with painted faces and nice clothing. And they're looking at her, kind of sizing her up. And, they're like, "What did you do, Grandma?" She's like, "I was making wine."
That's so cute.
And then she turns to them and she's like, "Well, why are you ladies in here?" And hopefully this isn't like, I don't think you have a lot of impressionable children listening, but they responded, they giggled. They're like, "We're here because we were making the men happy."
That's so cute. What a different world. Oh, that's funny. I just did an episode on Kate Ferretti. She's an Italian in Denver, and she was a famous hat maker. And so she moved from like downtown Denver to North Denver, Little Italy area. And she would have a bunch of like her really rich people drive to her hat shop in North Denver. What was during Prohibition time, and these women were really wealthy, and they would like pull up in a limo and go into her house and walk out with a box. Well, one of her neighbors turned her in, and so they came and raided her house, and she's like, "I'm just making hats." Like, that's it.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's so funny.
So now, was any of your family ever in Pueblo, or?
Nope, we were not that I know of. We were all Denver. So yeah. Yeah.
Because there was so much like, interconnections between the two. So now you're still in Denver?
Nope, I moved back in Grand Junction.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, but I was born and raised in Grand Junction, and then work took us to Denver, but we're back now. So yep. I miss Denver. I miss Denver 30 years ago with, that North Denver area is so special.
It really is. It really is. And I hope to catch like one of the feasts this summer if I can,
I know. I was talking to Mom about maybe going to the St. Rocco Festival in August. So yeah,
well,
they're a lot of fun.
Maybe I'll see you there.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Yeah. Well, this is great. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And can I tell people like where they can get the book?
Absolutely. And maybe where they can follow you on social media or website. So
this is a book. You can find it on Amazon, or if you want to support an independent seller, IAM Books in Boston, that's Italian American Books in Boston, is carrying it. And then if you want like an autograph copy or you want to buy directly from me, my website is mariannagatto.com, and that's my first name, Marianna, last name Gatto, Gatto.com.
Perfect.
And then also I'll say, like, if for your listeners, when and if they're in Los Angeles, we look forward to welcoming you. Admission to the museum is free. We do lots of great programs throughout the year. You can check out our entire permanent exhibition online. It's readable online. And our website is iamla.org. So that's iamla.org. And if you're, a history nerd like the two of us, um, you can also search our collection.
Mm.
All the collection that has been cataloged, which is now I think close to 6,000 items,
Wow.
is searchable online. And again, I know that many of your listeners don't necessarily have a Colorado connection.
Hmm.
But because Los Angeles was like this terminus, it was like the final place. You really couldn't go further west unless you went to like Hawaii. Uh, there's connections between, Los Angeles, this book, and like Chicago, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, Louisiana. So many people started elsewhere and then continued westward and finished in Los Angeles. So, you don't have to be somebody from here to appreciate the book.
Find
And
a connection somehow, I'm
yeah,
sure. Yeah.
yeah. And then if you are looking to, follow the museum on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. And I'm probably more active on Instagram these days as Gato Los Angeles. So
Okay. Perfect. Well, I'll put all of those in the show notes for the listeners
awesome.
to find as well.
Thank
So,
you. Thank
yeah.
you so very much. I look forward to meeting you in person one day, and you're going to have to remind me that we haven't met when we do meet, because whenever I do these Zooms, I really feel like, we started out at the beginning of the pandemic saying like, oh my God, what is this technology? And now like we kind of feel like we're in the same room. So I'm
Yeah.
probably going to say to you like, great, how nice to see you. So nice to see you. And you'll be like, wait a minute, we've never met, but
Yeah,
I
it
feel like
does.
we
It feels like you're right here. Yeah, I
have.
completely agree. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
definitely have to do that. So,
Well, it's been
perfect.
such a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
All right. Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, you too.